The standard explanation is familiar. The Vikings stopped raiding because Europe got better at defending itself. Because the monasteries built walls. Because the kingdoms consolidated and the soft targets hardened. It is a tidy explanation. And it is, at best, half the story. The other half begins not in Scandinavia but thousands of miles to the east, in the mountains south of the Caspian Sea, where silver had been flowing out of the earth in quantities that were, for the better part of 2 centuries, quietly funding one of the most extraordinary economic empires the medieval world had ever seen. To understand what happened to the Vikings, you first have to understand what the Vikings actually were. Not the raiders of popular imagination, though the raiding was real, but the economic system the raiding served. Because the Vikings were the most sophisticated long-distance traders of the early medieval world, operating a commercial network that stretched from the coast of Newfoundland to the river systems of Russia and down through the Caspian Sea to the markets of Baghdad. The raiding was one side of an economic coin. The trading was the other. And both sides of that coin had the same thing stamped on them: silver. The Viking economy ran on silver with a purity and a completeness that no other economy of the period matched. Specifically, Islamic silver minted in the Abbasid Caliphate, flowing northward through the river systems of Russia into Scandinavia in quantities that archaeologists have only recently begun to fully measure. Over 80,000 Arabic silver coins have been found in Scandinavia alone. More Arabic coins have been recovered from the Swedish island of Gotland than from any comparable area of the Arab world itself. The flow of Islamic silver into Scandinavia between 750 and 970 AD was not occasional commerce. It was a river. A sustained, high-volume, economically transformative river of silver that was the financial foundation on which the entire Viking world was built. And around the year 970 that river began to slow. Not because the Vikings stopped trading. Not because the Arab merchants lost interest. But because the silver mines near Baghdad were running dry. And nobody in Scandinavia knew it yet. The mines of the Samanid Empire in the mountains east of the Caspian Sea had been producing silver at extraordinary rates for 2 centuries. The dirham, the Islamic silver coin that the Vikings valued so highly they weighed it by the gram rather than spent it by denomination, was the product of those mines. When the mines began to exhaust themselves in the second half of the 10th century, the supply of dirhams reaching Scandinavia contracted sharply. The economic foundation on which the Viking world had been built for 2 centuries began very quietly to crack. The raiding economy was simultaneously becoming more expensive. The soft targets of the early period had been progressively hardened. Alfred the Great's fortified buzz in England, the Carolingian defensive reorganizations on the continent, the consolidation of European political authority, had been raising the cost of plunder for a generation. The silver from Baghdad had been supplementing the plunder, and the plunder had been supplementing the silver. When both sources came under pressure at the same time, the contraction was severe. The response is where the story becomes genuinely extraordinary. Because the Vikings did not simply decline. They pivoted. And the pivot they made from a bullion economy built on plunder and long-distance silver trading to a production economy built on what the northern world could make and the southern world could not, was one of the most consequential and least examined economic transitions of the medieval period. The commodities that replaced the silver were not glamorous. Walrus ivory, dried cod, woolen cloth, furs, timber, tar. Products of the cold northern environment that the warmer, more densely populated economies of southern Europe needed but could not produce for themselves. The walrus ivory trade filled the gap left by the disruption of African elephant ivory supplies. The dried cod trade fed Catholic Europe through its meatless Fridays and Lenten seasons with a preserved protein source that could travel any distance without spoiling. The woolen cloth connected Scandinavia to the emerging commercial centers of Flanders and the Rhineland. What these trades had in common was that they required production rather than extraction. The silver economy had been built on taking things from other people. The commodity economy required making things. That shift from extraction to production was the transition from the Viking Age to the medieval Scandinavian economy. It was driven by an event nobody in Scandinavia had caused and nobody could control. The mines ran dry. The silver stopped. And the people who had built their world on that silver had to find another way. What they found was, in its own way, more impressive than what they had lost. The full consequences of the transition did not become visible for generations. Economic transformations of this depth accumulate slowly, in the archaeological record, in the changing patterns of trade goods, in the gradual shift of what appears in the cargo manifests of northern ships across the 11th and 12th centuries. What those records show is a Scandinavian world unrecognizable in its economic structure from the one that had existed 2 centuries earlier. The Arabic dirham hoards had been replaced by locally minted coinage, smaller in quantity but more deeply integrated into a domestic monetary economy, developing the institutional infrastructure of markets, commercial law, and credit that the bullion economy had never needed. The longship routes to Baghdad had been replaced by the herring markets of the Baltic, the cod fisheries of Iceland, the walrus hunting grounds of Greenland, and the timber trade supplying a Europe entering the commercial expansion of the high medieval period. The Hanseatic League, the great northern European trading alliance that dominated Baltic and North Sea commerce for several centuries, was built in significant part on the commodity trades that the post-Viking economy had pioneered. The dried cod, the furs, the timber, the Baltic grain, the products of the northern world that the commodity transition had established as Scandinavia's economic foundation, became the primary goods of the Hanseatic system. The institutional innovation of the League, the formal commercial law, the permanent trading posts, the codified merchant practices, built on the informal commercial infrastructure that Viking traders had been developing since the Silver Crisis, forced them to become producers rather than plunderers. The Greenland colony that Eric the Red established around 985 AD is the most poignant symbol of the entire transition. Greenland was settled precisely because of the walrus. The waters around its coast held the largest walrus populations in the North Atlantic, and walrus ivory was the luxury commodity that the new production economy had placed at the center of Scandinavian commercial life. The settlers of Greenland were not adventurers seeking new land for its own sake. They were commodity producers following their primary resource to its source. The colony survived for nearly 5 centuries, sustained by the ivory trade, and began to fail when African elephant ivory re-entered European markets in the 14th century through the expanding Portuguese trading networks, and the price of walrus ivory collapsed. The Greenland colony had been born from the Silver Crisis, and it died from a commodity crisis. The economic logic that had created it was the same economic logic that eventually made it unsustainable. The market that the mine exhaustion had forced the Vikings to build was the same market that the changing terms of global trade eventually turned against their most remote outpost. That is the full arc of the bullion to market transition. From the silver mines of the Samanid Empire to the walrus hunters of Greenland. From the Arabic dirham hoards of Gotland to the cod markets of the Baltic. From a world built on taking to a world built on making. The shift happened because a mine ran dry in the mountains near the Caspian Sea. And it produced, over the following 3 centuries, the commercial foundations of the northern European economy that the modern world was eventually built on. The Vikings did not stop raiding because Europe got stronger. They stopped because the economic system that made raiding worthwhile had been undermined by an event on the other side of the known world. And what they built in its place outlasted the silver by 1,000 years.